turn on the auto, turn on the auto. It says we're streaming. And I'll put up this screen to tell that today we're doing metaphysics on Thursday. Hi, welcome. I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher, and I'm webcasting to you from my ITV studio here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today it's a Thursday, and so we're going to be talking about metaphysics, and I want to put up this new approach to announcing my lecture. This is the book on metaphysics, and it's in the form that I want you to know exists. It's available to you online with all the individual chapters. And today, this is a new way to introduce it, we're going to be talking about two chapters on identity and individuation. So let me switch to this screen, and there's our topic. And switch to this screen and do this one and bring myself up and see that we are really, I want this screen on the back. Thanks for bearing with me as I try to have a slightly new introduction to the program. This is my blog post, which always announces the lecture, Individuation, and the necessity of identity, two rather abstract concepts. Now, I'm testing out a new microphone and trying to avoid or eliminate a certain amount of static noise that we have been getting in the last few shows, but I do still hear it. Today I'm equipped with a little earphone, which I haven't had before, and I'm now able to hear when the music plays, for example, at the beginning of the show. I could try to get that level set here by turning on our music and see if I can hear it in the background at the same time you're hearing it. And right away we do not hear it, but maybe it'll start now. And it is playing, but I am not hearing it in my headphones. So a lot of learning going on the technical side. I'm here in this room, and I'm managing level controls on this set of audio controls over here, and I'm trying to manage the playing of the music. I'll try it one more time, and I do not hear it coming up. Perhaps it's because this needs to be switched on. There we go. So there's a lot for me to learn. I'll come back over here. And then now for the first time, there's that static. I expect you can hear it as well. I'm trying to decide how the music level should be relative to my voice. Let me go to camera 1 so you can share in my technical difficulties. And what I'm going to do is zoom in on this little screen that I'm using. I don't know if you can see it because it's extremely small, but here's the level control for the music, I think. Let's try it. I can raise it. Now it's way too loud compared to my voice, and I want to turn it down to where it's just playing in the background and you can sort of hear me over the music. And I probably should put a little piece of tape on this meter to indicate where I should set it in the future. Okay, back to my introduction and the title of today's lecture. It's a rather abstract, the static is quite difficult. People have been reporting the sound breaking up from time to time, and I have not, until this point, I've been able to understand what you're hearing. Let me switch to an overhead camera and show you the physical book. This can be, of course, bought in hard copy from Amazon, but you needn't do that if you are content to use the version which I made available to you as PDFs. So what we're looking at today is a chapter on individuation. Let me move in a little bit. And the next chapter, which I think is here, no, that's the mind-body problem, another one of our metaphysical problems, and our general problems. It's this chapter on identity, which is the next one we'll be looking at or talking about a little bit today. And this is an enormously long chapter. So let's switch back to the electronic version that's online. And I can drop into the individuation chapter. With a little luck, I can scroll this, and perhaps I can enlarge it. Let's see what I can do for that. Looks pretty good. Too big. And then we can scroll down. Well, we should be able to scroll down, but sometimes it's not too easy to get PDFs to perform quickly. So now let me take a look back at my blog post, and you'll see there we have the same lines that are in the chapter individuation of the book. So let's get into talking about this, but I hope I will be able to avoid the static electricity, sound, static noise that I've been getting in the past. So, since at least Aristotle's time, philosophers have been debating what it is that constitutes an individual person or a thing. Now, if I've got this one here and this one here, I should be able to get the words behind me. And it seems as if it's so obvious that an individual, we all recognize one another as individuals, but in ancient times and even down into the scholastics, the question was, what is it that made an individual human being into a person with a self? And we've been speaking recently about the notion that a self is the agent behind self-determination and so forth. And it's also the notion of having a soul or a spirit that's connected with us, or, in my argument, actually constitutes a human being, because we are not our material selves. I'm trying to argue that the matter is constantly being replaced in all organisms, and particularly just as well in ours all the time. Some of our cells, I always like to pick out the red blood cells, which are so important to us. 200 million of them dying every second in my body. And inside every one of those red blood cells are 300 million hemoglobin complexes, which are huge enzymes built out of proteins, little wonderful helix versions, 2 beta helices, 2 alphas, and they fold around one another to form a sphere around the heme, the iron atom in the middle, which is the actual carrier of the energy, travels around our body in our red blood cells. So we are surely that matter in some sense, but the matter, our matter, and that includes our brain, is not precisely what it is that we are when we are thinking. So I imagine our brain to be a place where information can be stored, and it's coming into us from our earliest days in our experiences, which get burned in to the neurons. As Donald Hebb says, when we have a sensation, it fires some neurons. Those neurons at the initial first experience of things, those neurons are chosen at random, more or less, because they've wired in to a child's neocortex at random. And so right away a very important chance element in ourselves. Then when we have a similar experience later, my argument is beyond what Donald Hebb said, that neurons that fire together wire together. I want to argue that neurons that have been wired together in the past, and so they've stored away a record of an experience, along with our vision and our sound sense and smell and so forth. There, we are, in my argument about an experience recorder and reproducer, we are also recording the emotional state we're in the early experience. And that gives a lot more importance if, when it plays back, having been stimulated by a future experience which in some way resembles the old one stored in our experience recorder, when the older experience or experiences that are similar are played back, there's a rush of the emotion that we associated with that original experience. And that's very important for survival value, that we know how to deal with an experience of a dangerous kind, for example. But more importantly, it's sort of the model for how it is we accumulate knowledge. This experience recorder and its ability to reproduce older experiences is what gives us the context that gives meaning to a current experience. If we have never learned anything, never had any experiences, things don't mean anything. For a child, they get recorded, and eventually when they play back in connection with future things that are similar, that provides a growth in knowledge. Experience, in my mind, is the same, acquiring knowledge about how we feel about things that are happening to us at the moment. Okay, but what part of us then is the individual self? And the ancients had various arguments. There were those who said, for example, taking in ideas that had come from the East, from India and across to the Mediterranean, the Middle East had this idea around the 6th century BCE, which was the idea of a soul. And scholars can establish when that came about. There had been other things that might arguably be trying to describe a person in this immaterial way, this spiritual way, the idea that there's something comes to the human being. Remember the Bible, the Torah, argues that there was an Adam. Adam was clay, and as clay, very much the material of ourselves, but Adam didn't have the breath of life. The notion of what the Greeks came to call a psyche, or psyche, is often pictured through the centuries as a breath, especially which infuses life into the clay, and now we have a possibility for a human being. But especially at death, when artists draw a breath, a person's last breath seems to carry away an immaterial spirit or a soul, which causes the body to die. And of course, through the centuries, there's been the exponent of an immortal soul that has immortality, lasts somewhere, returns to the heavens. And the Manichaeans or other dualists of the 2,000 years ago or so also argued that the soul had come down originally from the heavens, and one set of beliefs was the notion that as it traveled down, it depended on which planet it passed by. The Earth is at a certain place in its orbit, and as the soul comes down, if Mars is nearby, they argued, this young person is going to be a martial person. And if Venus comes down, it's going to be a loving person. I don't think they ever associated it with sex, but maybe they did. but the various planets were said to endow that soul with characteristics which came down and then inhabited the body of a human being. But this meant that there were some who thought that the individuality was coming with the soul. And so the soul individuated the matter. It gave it its individual nature. Others said that the soul was more a general thing, and the same soul could come down and go into two different bodies, and then the matter would do the individuating. Lots of argument about this, and it's widely regarded as a metaphysical problem, and I sort of apologize that these don't seem to be very dramatic issues for today, but they are important in the history of philosophy. And today in metaphysics, there's quite a rejuvenation of metaphysics in the last 10 or 20 years, after a century in which physical scientists who had become philosophers or philosophers influenced by physics declared that metaphysics was total nonsense. The so-called positivists believed that nothing really can be known except that which can be observed and touched and material and physical, and any of these notions that something spiritual is going on were ruled out. So-called holists who had imagined that there must be more to the world than just matter obeying physical laws and chemical laws and biological laws, they kept wanting to hang on to this other spirit or soul. And of course, all the religions, many religions wanted to hold on to it for obvious reasons. So I say from at least the time of Aristotle, they've been debating this what is it that makes an individual a unity, what's said to be a numerically one? We clearly think of each person as one, but clearly inside the person, inside the brain, many things are going on, and what is it that binds all those things together so as to make a person recognizable as that single person? Now, in modern times, of course, we've discovered that sometimes the brains of certain persons divide themselves, and the two parts, or three even, tend to be having an individuality, so that we have multiple personalities, multiple persons occupying one brain. The whole notion of schizophrenia, with part of the brain talking to another part of the brain, and the part that can speak about the problem saying that this person is hearing other persons, giving them instructions and advice, and there's an argument going on inside of one person. Those may have been known some time ago, but for the most part the idea is that a one mind, one brain has a personality, and the question is, where is it? What is it? And information philosophy, I'm going to argue, is going to provide answers that have really never been given or proposed to the problem of individuation, and a related problem of what is it to be identical to something else, the so-called problem of identity. So I point out that individuation is related to the metaphysical problems of constitution, of composition, colocation, essentialism, and identity. For us to go back to our book, and we went to the other chapters. Let's see if I can go back a little bit here. Here we are. You'll see there are other problems. There's identity, free will and God, immortality. There's essentialism. This is constitution, composition. How are we made up of parts? What are coinciding objects? And other issues. They're all related to this problem of individuation. So let's spend a little time with that. Scroll down here. The question is, given two equal amounts of matter, if it's only matter, you can distinguish them by their shape. One of the big questions around this in ancient times was a statue of an athlete or something. And the argument came to be that what if the statue's arm fell off, and we replaced the arm with a replacement arm of different but similar materials, so it looks like the original statue, what's happened to the statue? Does it continue to exist, or has it become something else because of this change of part of its matter? And then, given two things with identical form, they can be individuated by being embodied in different material. So we could have two statues that are identical to one another, and of course they only look identical because they are not the same, they are two, and that means they're distinguished by the fact that one is made of matter A and the other is made of matter B. Now in information philosophy, the concept of identity, I argue, depends on the total information in an object or in a concept. And now I'm arguing that the argument about what something is constituted by, what gives it its identity, is information. But that includes, of course, information about the particular atoms, molecules, or cells, or however you want to divide up the matter that's inside an object. A concept, of course, is immaterial. It has no matter. We could have examples that are built-up examples that show the concept with some sort of a machine or just an object with a shape, and that the shape is the concept. And it's not perfectly clean, but the basic idea is that immaterial information is what is the primary thing that's in a concept. We can then distinguish the intrinsic information inside the object or concept from any relational information with respect to other objects, and we call that extrinsic or external information. And it's not too hard to say that we can pick out the intrinsic information as that which is self-identical in an object. The Greeks called this �αυτο, or self-relation, or ἰδίος ποιον, or ποιον, the peculiar qualifications of the individual. And self-identity is the simple fact that the intrinsic information and the extrinsic relational, or what they call dispositional information, are unique to this single object. No other object can have exactly the same disposition relative to other objects. This is an absolute kind of identity. Some metaphysicians say that such identity is logically necessary, and this is one of the big arguments going on in the metaphysics in Western literature in the last 20 years or so. Some say that being self-identical is the only thing that should be properly called identity. But now, with my work in information philosophy, I believe we can support those philosophers who argue for a relative identity. So let me come back. These are deep technical jargon terms, and I perhaps need to come to tell you a little bit more about them. Let me come back onto the screen. Imagine that we have two objects. Max Planck famously said, what if he could create or imagine two black spheres? Apt, I think they were called black by Max Planck, and they have no other attributes than their size. So there's, say, a 1 foot diameter sphere. Two of them, though, and they're otherwise perfectly identical. And he wrote an article that generated hundreds of other commentaries through the ages, through the many years. The Black article, I'm not sure I remember the exact date, but because I'm here, I can type in Max Planck, and we can go back and take a look at him. Max Planck. And basically, he's asking the question, let me see what I've just done on this screen. I did a search, and I found Max Planck. He was an analytic language philosopher who worked with Peter Geach to translate the philosophical writings of Gottlob Freud. Okay, that's on this screen, so if I go here, I can come back to me. We spoke recently about Frege, who pointed out that it was impossible for two individuals to have exactly the same idea about something. Notice that the philosophers who are arguing for identity of the individual need to understand that they also could be asking questions about how close, how exactly similar could two ideas be. And Gottlob Frege had this terrific insight to say you cannot have this exactly the same idea in two individuals. He's this famous problem who makes the argument about the names of Venus, the morning star and the evening star, two names for the same object. Of course, there's a situational difference. We only see the morning star in the morning, so Venus in the morning has a difference from Venus in the evening, so-called evening star. Hesperus and Phosphorus were their names in Greek, and the ancient Greeks didn't know at some point that Hesperus and Phosphorus were actually the same planet. But the Babylonian astronomers, who knew many of these things much earlier than almost anyone else, had identified all the planets exactly, and they know that when Venus disappeared in the morning, only to appear a few weeks later in the evening, it had just gone past the sun, which blocked it out in the times when it wasn't either showing up in morning or evening times. But this is clearly related to the question of do we have here two things or one thing with two names? And what is it to have two names for the same thing? This was raised by Gottlob Frege. It continues to be a big problem in metaphysics and in the whole idea of how we argue for our ideas. What are our ideas? And so Geach and Black were taken by the question of what constitutes identity. And Black wrote, as I point out here, a somewhat cryptic dialogue between person A and person B, perhaps ironically questioning whether A can ever be said to be identical with any B. And of course they cannot, because A always has the property of being A, of being itself, which can never be true of B, well, since B is being B. That may sound super trivial, but it came to be the basis for an argument for what's called the necessity of identity. And it's a little three-step argument in, it looks like mathematical logic, because in math, we always try to say things like A equals B, by which we mean, say, if there are two lines, A and B have exactly the same length, and they're identical with respect to their length. But if the two lines are exactly, let's say, parallel, we can say that they have the same length, but they're not in the same place. So they are not identical with respect to their place. And so in my work, I'm trying to add a descriptor, we could say, that whenever we describe something, we have to describe all its attributes. And if we include where they are located with respect to one another, we see that they are two different things. So Max Planck's two spheres, otherwise identical, one is here and one is there, and the sphere we might call A is never exactly the same as B, because B is external to it. A then enjoys the relationship that it has another sphere, the sphere B, in its neighborhood, and vice versa. This can only be clearly sort of stated, argued, thought about, if you realize we're always trying to describe the total information in an object. If this is the case, then as long as other objects which are asking about how identical they are, what I call relative identity, we could say about Max Planck's two spheres that the other sphere is relatively identical. It has the same color, it has the same shape, and it could have exactly the same weight within experimental errors. And so we would have two objects that have what I describe as relative identity. So, come back, let's see, if I just go down for a moment, I'd like to get Black. So he died in 1988, and I don't have the date when he wrote this article, but I think this is it. Here's the only remaining distinction between the two spheres in Black's construction of identical spheres in otherwise empty space. And he starts off talking with technical jargon. The principle of the identity of indiscernibles seems to me obviously true. So what is the identity of indiscernibles? It means you cannot discern a difference. So two things are indiscernible, indiscernibly different. You argue that they're the same. Right away, though, you've had to forget the fact that when you see two, they are not one. And so the only true identity in my argument is self-identity. The only thing that is identical with you as an individual is yourself. You could have an identical twin, but we can't say that the twin is identical to you. The problem of identity, then, is to establish the total information that's in a given thing that we're comparing to other things, and there will always be differences. Now, in ancient times, if they had the same color, shape, various things, it looked to them that that was what they could call identity. And for some reason, they don't normally go on to say, well, but there are two. It's striking how long it takes for a philosopher to say, look, if we see two, they are not identical. They're only what I would call relatively identical to one another because of all the other information, all the other parameters, descriptors that we have for them. Right down the line, they all seem to be no different from one another. So two things with no difference. Max Black's two spheres, for example, have a kind of identity, but it must, in my view, in information philosophy, be called relative identity. So here's Black's debate, and we're going to see that this discussion of the identity of indiscernibles goes way back to Leibniz and was discussed very often in the work of Bertrand Russell and several other major thinkers down to Willard Van Orman Quine and his students, including Saul Kripke, who lives to this day, living, working philosopher, who make a great deal out of this principle of identity, arguing that there's a case to be made that if A equals B, then A must necessarily equal B. And I know that must seem strange to you, but such is the content of metaphysics these days. So this is the long essay of that argument. It was titled The Identity of Indiscernibles, and it appeared in 1952 in the journal Mind. Okay, let me switch back then to our lecture topic over on the blog today, and I'll bring that to full screen here and say, to visualize the concept of information identity, imagine putting yourself in the position of an object. Look out at the world from its vantage point. No other object has that exact same view because it's a unique place. And we could now say if we include the relation to other objects around you and their relation to you, we can talk about the intrinsic information identicality of Max Black's two spheres, and we could identify a very large numbers of objects and concepts in the world that are intrinsically identical, including a whole bunch of things that we build to be identical, either naturally. Certain natural objects seem to be very like one another. A clone of a large molecule, when we get down to molecules, they seem very much the same. And we do, in fact, find out that quantum physics gives us a kind of identity and indiscernible character that is absent for anything of a much larger structure. And I point out that we could think of those things as digital kinds which are identical bit for bit. And that is the most perfect relative identity we have. So if we have two two different, see if I can close this door of trying to update my Surface Pro. We can argue that a computer program can be duplicated bit for bit. A musical CD or DVD is at the level of the little pits in the laser that the laser picks out as it plays the DVD. Those are bit for bit identical. They don't have to be physically. If you go in and look, you'll see there are large craters in a lot of aluminum surface. But for digital purposes, they are digitally identical. And that gets now into the realm of what is information. If we make it abstract to the point of our thoughts, we can make arguments about whether my thoughts are the same as your thoughts. And as Gottlob Freud, we almost could say Frege's rule, is that none of us ever have exactly the same thoughts or concepts or ideas. We come very close, says Frege. And it may be when we do that, the way we get there into having relatively identical thoughts, which of course allows us to communicate with one another. But if you mean something by one word and I mean something slightly different by the same word, we may be in communication difficulties. And there are a lot of philosophers, especially language philosophers, who question the whole project of communicating, like to argue that words are so ambiguous, they're always slipping around in meaning. And you get to the extreme case of Lewis Carroll and his Humpty Dumpty character, I think it was, who says, words mean precisely what I want them to mean, and nothing else. And of course we do have that ability, and every society has had this experience of their words changing their meaning. And often, suddenly, one word goes over to meaning something else in a relatively short period of time throughout a culture. It's quite interesting. Languages I've studied in that way, they are very dynamic and growing and changing. And there's a whole notion that language evolves like life and grows, and there's a tree of life, much like a tree of language that's much like a tree of life. And those comparative linguists who study language over time, the so-called diachronic study of language going back in time, argue that it looks as if there's something going on, as if there was an or language, there was a first language when the first Homo sapiens started to do more than grunt, and they started articulating beyond the gesturing and the grunting or watch out there and so forth. They came to have the kind of words in our language. It then split over time because the groups that first talked to one another may have divided into two groups, traveled away from one another for a long time, and they started changing the way they were using their words. Next thing you know, we have two individual languages going on, and they are no longer identical to one another, which is our discussion today. So in 1947, I point out a very interesting thing happened in America. A woman named Ruth Barkan, later married a fellow named Marcus. Ruth Barkan Marcus wrote an article on, quote, the identity of individuals. And this combines our two topics today of what it is to be an individual and what it is to be identical. It was the first assertion of what we call today the necessity of identity. Now, Marcus's work was written up in really dense symbolic expression terms. I can give you a look at them, but I thought I would boil it down a little bit. She gave very little explanation of her overall argument. It was just published in symbolic literature. But a few years after Ruth did her work, her thesis advisor, Frederick Fitch, published his book called Symbolic Logic, which is one of the better ones. There are a half dozen of important books on symbolic logic. And I think I see this as the simplest proof ever of what they were thinking when they said that if things were identical, they must be necessarily identical. Okay? Let's see if I can point out the things that I want to show you here. maybe I will go to my book section on identity and fasten your seatbelts, and we'll kind of enlarge this, and I'll take you through, okay, information identity. The whole discussion back to the Greeks. We need what's called a criterion for identity, and Wittgenstein wrote about this, and so did some other important philosophers. And what I want to say, my definition is that nothing is perfectly identical to anything but itself. And I see I haven't brought this up for you. My apologies. Let's go here. And so I'm talking about having a criterion for what I call relative identity. And I argue that nothing is perfectly identical to anything but itself. So the criterion for relative identity is always to say that the identity is in some respect, or what philosophers called qua. Some person is famous qua golfing or something, in respect to their golfing. That in that respect is that some subset, what we're talking about here, of the information in two different things must be the same information bit for bit. I don't want to get into this page because it's very long. I just want to show you it gets kind of mathematically long also. Besides a criterion for identity, I propose a criterion for what is the essential nature of something in terms of information. Here's Husserl and Gottlob Freud. I want to keep going down. Here's the background of the problem all the way back to Plato, writing about Socrates and the Theaetetus. Then there's Aristotle. And we start to come more forward in time. Here's Leibniz, who made the argument that two things can be identical if you can't see any difference. If they're indiscernibles, then we see no differences, then they may be identical. And there's a lot to work here about Leibniz. Then there's Frege. What is it to be something? He says X is F. These metaphysicians who deal in identity problems are always talking about this is F and that is F, and what does it mean to be F, and so forth. And when can A be B, and so forth. So the problem of names, which we talked about, because there are two names for the planet Venus, and what does that mean? Here's Charles Sanders Peirce, who introduced some very powerful logical terms. Then there's Bertrand Russell in the Principia Mathematica. Ludwig Wittgenstein then did a lot of work that I find very similar to the work that Russell was doing, but he has some interesting things to say about it. Then there's a translator or someone who worked on the Wittgenstein Tractatus, and so he also published some important stuff. And here's Quine, who was a student of Alfred North Whitehead, the partner with Bertrand Russell, who wrote the Principia Mathematica. And he, Willard Van Orman Quine, came to be the thesis advisor or managed students, including Saul Kripke and David Lewis. So enormous influence on modern philosophy. Here's Max Black's work, the story we just saw. And here's Ruth Barkan Marcus. And I just want to, here is her argument for the necessity of identity. And it's pretty difficult to understand what this is, but I just want to show it to you. As I say, for historical completeness, it wasn't very easy for me to type this into HTML because you're looking at a web page and it isn't easy to create something of this logic. But now we're back to Friedrich Fitch and his few statements right here. So let me switch over to the screen I was stuck on there for a moment. And here's how Fitch did this argument. Step 1, A equals B. The claim is A is equal to B. It's identical to B. Of course, we know now in my arguments with information philosophy that that's only a relative identity. But then, step 2 in the argument, there's a little box, a little square, which logicians use to refer to the operator. It's called necessity. And you read that little thing, that box, as, it is necessary that, Okay? So I'll just come back to this screen for a moment. And what am I trying to do here? I want to bring up this one for you. Right. So the first line says A is equal to B. However, we know that, here's the little necessity condition. We know that it's necessary that A equals A. Okay? And then he says, well, A is equal to B, and it's necessary that A equals B, therefore it's necessary that A equals B. Because we can substitute B into this statement and it turns into A equals A. And we can, by eliminating or substituting one of these into the other equation, if you like, we create the necessity. Now, all of that seems pretty remote to me. It's definitely something that's true in mathematics. If you have A equals B, and there's a bunch of equations, and the equations involve B here and there and wherever throughout the equation, you're entitled to take every appearance of B, replace it with an A, and you still have a true, logically correct, mathematically correct statement, okay? And that is what these logicians are doing. This is the greatest work that logicians who do symbolic logic with symbols, this is their great work. I am, however, very, very skeptical about the value of stepping from this ability to think logically and reason logically about mathematical issues and using this to figure out anything about the world. In my view, logic is a tool, reason is a tool. We use it to draw conclusions about what's going on, but when we draw the conclusion, we have to go out and look at the world and check what's going on in the world to see whether what we've just gotten to logically corresponds to something that's possible in the world. That's my view, that we have all this information, we have all this knowledge, and we try harder and harder to get to understand the way the world works more and more clearly, and it gets more difficult as we get down to elementary particles or to atoms and wondering what's going on with an electron's motion inside the atom, where we cannot put an observer or an observing tool or a measuring instrument, although that may change because we're getting better and better at all of our studies, even down to the microscopic world. But this argument of that since A is B and necessarily A is A gets elaborated rather soon after this paper by Ruth Barkan Marcus. Let's see, am I on the scrolling screen? Yes, I am. So you'll see, I'll switch that to you here. You see that 14 years after her paper, Marcus presented a work at the 1961 colloquium at Boston University, and Quine came to the meeting. Okay? So Marcus reprised the proof of her claim about the necessity of identity. She explicitly added Leibniz's law relating identicals and indiscernibles to her argument. And this is the sentence. It's a little hard to read the sentence, but it's something like, given x and given y, and given x equals y, then it implies, this implies that it's necessary that x equals y. In a formalized language, these symbols which name things will be those for which it is meaningful to assert that I holds between them, where I names the identity relation. She wrote all of this, and there then came to be quite an interesting controversy, because two more of my philosophers who are on that big web page in the column down to the left start to argue about this, and argued with one another and with Quine and so forth. I don't think that Marcus got too involved, and I'm not even sure that this fellow Wiggins knew what Marcus had done exactly. But Saul Kripke then developed an argument on identity, and it turns out he thinks he got the idea from Wiggins, and I've worked on this. There was a famous book, a book called Identity Statements, which I've carefully studied, and I like Huygens a lot for many reasons. But it turns out that all the work that Huygens had done and Kripke had done came from Ruth Barkan Marcus. And here I am noticing that, as we've seen so many times in just recent years, women are often just sort of run over and ignored for stuff that they've done and are the original. In my mind, Ruth Barkan Marcus stands behind all of this. So what I've done on this page is to compare the exact thought of Huygens with the thought of Kripke and try to see how this both came from Marcus. And I put in here that little Fitch simplicity and clarity of Marcus's thesis advisor. I had a little paragraph in here I thought that kind of summed up my arguments with respect to this subject. Here's Peter Geach again. And here's David Lewis. Lewis came to thinking about what they call modal realism or modal possibilities, and he's the one who came up with this famous idea that any possible world that is possible is in fact realized somewhere. And there's a lot of parallel worlds thinking and many worlds thinking in physics that corresponds to what Lewis got to by just saying, look, if it's possible, it happens somewhere. And I have a friend, David Laser, who argues that because of the infinite nature of the world, one can go somewhere in the universe, the arrangement of things there will be essentially the same as here, given the nature of infinity. He argues to infinite numbers of worlds, all of them unreachable. And of course, all of this talk about possible worlds are not worlds that we can go to, but especially when it's so difficult to make two little things identical to one another with precision, it's amazing that these philosophers, one hand, mathematicians, mathematical physicists like Max Tegmark, Hugh Everett and his idea of many worlds, it's amazing that they think that they can copy somewhere else in the infinite universe the entire visible or observable universe that we have here today. It's unbelievably extravagant. John Bell called it extravagant. It's just absurd and totally impossible to contact. But let's scroll down a little bit more here. And we're talking here about relative identity. And I'm not sure, and I have a set of arguments about from Charles Peirce, which correspond a lot to my notion of A as A. A as A is often used to start off an argument to show that the person who's writing the book is a very logical and clear thinker. Ayn Rand used this a lot. Clearly, we have to say that A is A, for example. But it turns out, you notice what I tried to introduce at the beginning? What's going on right here? It looks to me like this is two A's. They are not identical, because we can say the A on the left is equal to the A on the right. But do you see how that's only a relative identity? Let's say this A is that A with respect to its shape. Or if they're both the same color, they're the same color. That might help, although we abstract away from color in order to understand the nature of an A. They are identical in that they're the same letter in our alphabet. So with respect to letters in the alphabet, these are identical and interchangeable. But there always are limits insofar as you and I can see that they contain different information. So this is such a long chapter. You'll have to spend a great deal of time, should you, in your future life, becoming an information philosopher or trying to think deeply about these subjects that others are doing. You would need to read a lot, and I've packed a lot into this one chapter. Here's the question of whether something now is the same individual tomorrow. It's an enormous subject today. There are those who think that just as the world is in different space sections and can be divided, so with time, and you can argue that every instant a person even is changing identity. one of my chapters in the puzzles, end of this book. Maybe a little amusing to jump to that. Let's go back to our metaphysics book, and let's go down to where we get into puzzles beyond these issues of possibility and actuality and all of these other things, space and time. Here's the idea of vagueness, wave-particle duality. So here are some puzzles or paradoxes. One is called the debtor's paradox. So let's just open that up. Why don't we just open that right here and overwrite this one. Here's the debtor's paradox. Let me enlarge it on the screen again. Oh my goodness, look at that. There we go. Looked like it turned upside down. Let me take this to full screen while we look a little bit at a question of whether a person is the same person tomorrow. Epicharmus was one of the authors of Greek comedies, and he studied maybe with Pythagoras and Heraclitus, which, of course, he's the philosopher that everything is changed and is always changing. You can't step into the same river twice and so forth. And so in one of his comedies, he introduced a man who wants to break his contract with a lender on the grounds that he is not the same man that made the contract. The lender then beats the debtor, so angry he just assaults the debtor, but the lender then who gets sued for assault by the debtor, and the two guys come before the courts. One wants to get his money back, and the other one claims he wants to be hold the other guilty of assault. So when called before the courts, notice what the debtor had said is, I am not the same person who made the contract. I am somebody now, today, and I am not the same man that made the contract. So the lender comes into court, and when he's called in, he says, I am not now the same person who committed the assault. And modern metaphysicians describe this as a problem of our temporal parts. Just like objects in space have parts, objects in time have parts. This time I'm me, later on I'm not me. There may be a resemblance, but I'm not exactly the same information. And indeed, our bodies are changing with time so fast that we're made up of different matter. Next year, 10 years later, 8 decades like me later, I am not, hardly any single atom in my body is the same as there was 81 years ago. And that's the point of temporal, only relative identity. So let's go back and think that we've made a connection between an individual, how we identify an individual, and how that individual's information can be perfectly the same as another individual, only relatively, because as with the A equals A, however slight the information is in those two, they are two different things. And we need to distinguish them as only relatively identical. Did I want to do something else with you today? I think so. Let's see where I might go. Back to the book. So in the individuation chapter, which is a lot smaller, you'll find that the kind of thing that the early philosophers were getting to was, what was it? Was it the matter, the houle, or was it the theory of forms? And Plato's theory of forms, or ideas, he named the word idea, came from a Greek word eidos, which means shape or form. I want to say to you that information philosophy is all about forms, that you are a form, I'm a form, and the matter and energy that are used to keep and maintain our form, it's magical. It keeps us alive, and it is pure information, just like the Platonic ideas, and it's information in our brain that's getting us to be who we are, and it's information in our cells that are keeping us to be the living thing that we are. But now I'm running out of time. Maybe I'll turn on this music and see if it comes back on. I guess that's a reasonable level. And I'm going to say goodbye for today, and I hope you'll join me again when the topic is Albert Einstein. In a way, each day of the week, I'm tracing along one course in philosophy or science, and hope to be doing that for the foreseeable future. And I can't do it without someone who's interested. So thank you very much for being with me. And I noticed that everything is looking good. We're recording several different places. I'll say goodbye.